extremities. Vitals are stable. Bleeding is well controlled. Copy. We were doing ER day. She needs sutures. Third patient suffered multi-stab with bilateral hands. Looks like bleeding is well controlled. Vital signs are stable. Take her to another ER day. Minor stitches.
Really?
Hey.
How was it?
Grace is critical. The other two aren't. Thank God. They know the attacker. Ava just said it was some man in a mask. He tapped Grace out of nowhere. Her and Charlotte went up to help. He snapped them and then ran off. We're gonna need a better description for the follow-up.
And also the parents' contact information. God, this is their parents' worst nightmare.
Okay. Do you have any enemies?
Like, leave the audio on, but then mute your computer
Yeah.
because it's feeding back on the mic. So turn on this audio if that's what you're getting the audio, but then turn your computer volume off. This. Okay. It's okay?
Start over.
All right. Final time.
Anyone is connecting the room, please mute the meeting.
Yes. For everyone connecting online, please mute your mics. We will have room for questions towards the end. We do need to mute that. Okay.
That's how. No, David, close.
Okay. Welcome to Murder on the Land and Sea Extrajudicial Drug War Killings in the 21st Century, a side event at the 69th session of the United Nations Commission on Narcotic Drugs, organized by the DRC Net Foundation, aka stopthedrugwar.org, with co-sponsors Associazione Luca Cocciene, Drug Policy Alliance, Forum Droge, International Drug Law Advocacy and Resource Center, No Peace Without Justice, No Box Transitions Philippines, the Philippine Coalition for the International Criminal Court, Veterans Action Council, the Washington Office on Latin America, and Students for Sensible Drug Policy, or SSDP. Thank you also to members of the local Filipino community, and especially Maricel Rojas, for their support. If you're joining us in person here today, please add your name to the sign-in sheet. Otherwise, you can always register for this event to get updates afterwards. My name is Kat Murthy. I'm excited to be here today. I'm Executive Director of SSDP, the largest grassroots network working to end the war on drugs and replace it with policies rooted in science, compassion, and human rights, policies that make sense. At SSDP, we say the war on drugs is a war on us. Decades of drug war prohibition have demonstrated that laws intended to prevent drug use ultimately harm not only the consumers, their families, and their communities, but as drug use is stigmatized and drug users are dehumanized, so-called anti-drug policies have the capacity to shatter democratic and human rights norms entirely. From Latin America to Asia, tens of thousands of individuals around the world have lost their lives to extrajudicial killings conducted in the name of drug prevention and control. I have the distinct honor of being your moderator for what promises to be a critically important discussion of drug war extrajudicial killings here in the 21st century, their context and interrelationships, and their implications for the future of democracy and rule-based order. To begin, I'd like to introduce you all to David Borden. Dave is the founder and executive director of stopthedrugwar.org, pioneering the use of the internet for education and organizing in drug policy reform and helping found SSDP. David is a veteran advocate for sensible drug policy at the United Nations and oversees stopthedrugwar.org's Rule of Law program, which tracks serious human rights abuses in the global drug war with a primary focus on extrajudicial killings in the Philippines, where former President Rodrigo Duterte's drug war killing campaign has taken the lives of as many as 30,000 people without trial. Duterte was arrested for crimes against humanity of murder exactly 1 year ago today and is currently imprisoned by the International Criminal Court in The Hague. Thanks in part to the unfailing advocacy of stopthedrugwar.org and Dave, who organized numerous events drawing attention to the issue at the CND, the Human Rights Council, the High-Level Political Forum on Sustainable Development, ICC's Assembly of States Parties, and online. The first held in what was supposed to be our original room in 2017, featured a video provided by the then Vice President Leni Roberto of the Philippines, which has become controversial there due to its strong criticisms of the Duterte drug policies, criticisms I think we probably all share. However, extrajudicial killings in the Philippines, despite Duterte's arrest, still continue at a reported rate of nearly 1 life lost every single day. Dave?
Thank you, Kat. Thank you to my fellow panelists here and online, all of you joining us online, and especially all of you here for finding us in person in this big, new, beautiful room, albeit less historic for our very specific purposes. So the Philippines under Duterte is the best known and largest case of extrajudicial drug war killings, but there have been others. The first, or at least the first well-publicized case, took place in Thailand in 2006 when 3,000 alleged drug law violators were murdered at the instigation of then Prime Minister Thaksin Shinawatra. The Duterte killings were accompanied by smaller but also significant outbreaks in Indonesia and Bangladesh. OHCHR reported in 2019 on a drug war killing spree or incident under the Maduro regime, in fact, in Venezuela. The phenomenon has an international dimension, or it certainly appears to. Indonesian President Joko Widodo, when he greenlighted the Indonesia killings, this was just a short time after Trump, as president, had praised Duterte for his drug war. Not long after the boat strikes being carried out by the U.S. military at the time off the coast of Venezuela had begun, Brazilian police committed the worst massacre in their history, murdering over 100 alleged drug trade participants in one of Rio de Janeiro's favelas. The boat strikes, in turn, I can only speculate, but they may well have been inspired by what Duterte did, based on Trump's prior words. At least one official in the Caribbean, the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, has praised the boat strikes using violent language herself. We should closely watch developments in the recently launched quote-unquote Shield of the Americas coalition the administration has formed. So we've worked on this since 2017, as you've heard, and I am very proud of the work done by friends and colleagues in the Philippines. That truly is what made the ICC case against President Duterte possible. But it is saddening that we in the US are now in a similar place. Though Trump's drug war killings have so far remained outside of our borders, and though the numbers, 158 to date, 6 of them just this week, compared with Duterte's are still small, it's bad enough. And Trump's drug war killings might not remain outside our borders. Escalating violence by immigration and border agents in the president's mass deportation campaign raise our concerns on that latter point. For me, at least, the president's very dramatic negative shift toward unfavorability in polls, over 30% among some key demographic groups, also raises this concern. What might Trump feel he needs to do later this year? Whether those fears of worse things to come are ever realized, the tasks we face in the US now are parallel to those that were undertaken by our friends and colleagues in the Philippines. Stopping the killings while systematically gathering the evidence that will be needed for eventual criminal prosecutions of the civilian and military officials who have directed this extraordinarily violent, ongoing crime, a crime of the highest order. Easier said than done. In the US justice system, it's entirely possible that a future administration, the Department of Justice, would see this as important to take on. But we have a divided judiciary now in the United States. Our Supreme Court, which is controlled by an ideologically extreme, possibly politicized majority, made a series of unprecedented interventions during the year leading up to our election, which made it impossible to complete prosecutions that had been initiated against President Trump for crimes that were also of the highest order, which had been broadcast live on television. That majority also issued a much condemned ruling on presidential immunity, which, along with protecting a chief executive for crimes committed in the course of carrying out presidential duties, most shockingly barred prosecutors from even gathering information in such situations. Although a footnote written by the Chief Justice supposedly offers some kind of path for that. Internationally, the most likely prosecutions to happen would be under universal jurisdiction laws that many countries now have, in which advocates can initiate cases over alleged human rights violations. These are the most likely because advocates like us can start them. The other option, and this is for hard accountability, I'm not going to address what I'll call soft accountability measures for raising the issue, is the International Criminal Court. For that to be possible, it would be necessary to demonstrate that a given boat, which was destroyed by a U.S. strike, was registered with a country, the government of a country that is a member of the Rome Statute. This would give the court jurisdiction under the maritime provisions of Article 12. One of the chief barriers to obtaining such information, or indeed any information about victims, you may have noted there have been very few specific reports about who's been killed or any other details, is the suppression of information done very effectively by the Venezuelan government itself, and by the fear instilled in people by the actions of the U.S. government. Both of these have made victims afraid or even unable to speak up. For the ICC to take this on, it would also be necessary to demonstrate that the crimes have sufficient gravity to justify the involvement of the ICC, which is meant to address the world's worst crimes. Even the thousands acknowledged, or the tens of thousands alleged, believed to have been killed, had that question. With these boat strikes, despite the small number, it's the case that the chief executive of the world's largest government has asserted an unchecked right to kill. And in one way, the Trump administration has gone further than the Duterte administration in that Duterte's chief spokespersons claimed, while the president took credit for the killings, that he was joking or that the victims fought back, non laban in Filipino, and that's why they were killed. Trump's chief people have defended the killings directly and asserted that they have the right to do it. So I am told I am out of time. Thank you for doing your job. I'll just say that lastly, that if more people had spoken up about this and made it clear that murder is murder, people on the right in the U.S., a more full set of the Democratic politicians in the U.S. who did not cheer the killings, but some of whom were reticent, leaders of European governments especially who were not full-throated about this, perhaps the death toll would be smaller, and perhaps the risk of extrajudicial killings spreading to other countries would also be smaller. One of the ways that authoritarians advance their agenda is by exploiting issues which divide the opposition.
Thank you, and thank you. Thank you, and thank you for ending on that strong note and reminder to all of us. I would like to invite up Carlos Conde, online, who's joining us online. He was not able to join us in person because of the unfortunate issues happening around the world right now. So Carlos is a veteran Filipino journalist and a human rights advocate. As senior researcher at the Asia Division of Human Rights Watch, his research focused on extrajudicial killings of activists, journalists, legal professionals, peasant leaders, environmentalists, and indigenous peoples as a direct result of the war on drugs in the Philippines. He documented allegations of torture, enforced disappearances, and press freedom violations, and wrote reports on death squads, the HIV/AIDS epidemic in the Philippines, child labor, and the impact of the anti-drug campaigns on the children left behind by its victims. Before joining Human Rights Watch, Conde worked as a journalist for 20 years, mainly as a freelance correspondent in the Philippines for the New York Times, and served as Secretary General of the National Union of Journalists of the Philippines. In early 2026, Carlos founded Rights Report Philippines, a nonprofit focused on human rights in the Philippines. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, David and company for the invitation to speak in this panel. I don't have much to say in terms of what happened in the Philippines during the drug war because a lot of that has been covered by a lot of other colleagues and just now by David. We know the statistics, we know the number, we know how it happened. But just briefly to note that if there's one thing that was apparent in the drug war in the Philippines during Duterte's time was how he thoroughly exploited the so-called quote-unquote drug problem in the Philippines to advance his political agenda. Because let's make no mistake about what he did during the time. He basically upended Philippine democracy. Duterte made the drug menace the central justification for his presidency and for nearly everything afterward. The actual scale of drug use was systematically inflated, as we all know. Legitimate statistics were ignored and suppressed. By defining the nation as under essential threat of the drug menace, quote unquote, he positioned himself as the only man ruthless enough to save it. So this was the playbook by Duterte during his regime. Fear took hold across the Philippines, but more particularly in governance, in law enforcement agencies. The campaign, the double barrel and the Tokhang campaign, these are the drug campaigns that resulted in the killings of thousands and thousands of people, was not only a policy from the executive department, but it was enforced across the Philippines as a method of fear, as a method of control. So this was all really, really documented. And the effect of that is we have had in the Philippines, a civil society that is under threat, a media that's been severely under pressure. We have human rights defenders who are intimidated, and we have a largely Philippine population that's still not brave enough to speak out then and even now. That the magnitude of the support Mr. Duterte gets from his supporter here and in abroad, particularly in the diaspora, they're still framing the narrative in the Philippines about what happened, and even on the issue of accountability for Mr. Duterte in the ICC. And this is a huge problem that we're facing now as Mr. Duterte is facing justice at the ICC. You see here an increasing number of disinformation campaign by his supporters. You see an increasing number of intimidation and threats by his supporters online and even offline. The problem has not disappeared just because Mr. Duterte is in the ICC. And more than that, the legacy of the drug war, the legacy of this brutal policy in the Philippines is, I think, it will take decades to reform. In terms of the law enforcement, for instance, we have a situation here where everybody's convinced that the Philippine National Police and many of their attached agencies were willing participants. It was clear from the very beginning that they were willing participants in the brutality, but also now they are perceived to be protected by their own. This was clear in the way the police in the Philippines during the drug war behaved with impunity, and the promise by Mr. Duterte to protect them apparently was one of the main reasons why they kept doing what they're doing. And so far, we have not had any significant number of police officers or officials who have been taken to account for all the killings that had happened. So far, it's only Mr. Duterte that's in the ICC, but we hope that many more will be taken to the court. We don't know when that will happen. Now, finally, I would like that's a kind of a general overview of what's been happening here. I'm conscious of the time, but I would like to touch on what David said at the end of his presentation, which is the role of the international community here. I cannot stress enough, and this has been something that's really bothering me for a long, long time. I cannot stress enough how the international community has failed in its duty to stop the drug war in the Philippines, or at least to mitigate the impact. I'm talking about the UN Human Rights Council and other attached UN agencies. They know what was happening. They had the numbers, but nothing happened in any significant manner. The UN Human Rights Council Commission on Inquiry was never, it never materialized. They had in its place what they called the UN Joint Program, but that was mostly workshops and capacity building, but never really, never really on accountability. The EU is also a total failure on this one. While we often hear European officers or officials saying that they're committed to democracy and they have programs, certain programs in the Philippines, the most important tools that the EU had to try to stop the drug war or to influence the outcome, they never use it. I'm talking about the GSP Plus, the General Scheme of Preference Plus, which is a tariff regime that they should have used on the Philippines. They did it in Sri Lanka, but they did not do it on the Philippines. The question now is, why is that? And now the European Union and the Philippines are in the middle of negotiations for a free trade agreement, and nothing so far that we see in the reporting of these free trade agreement negotiations has any indication of a rights-based approach. Finally, the ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian, is an utter failure in this one. Its its policy of non-interference among members is partly a main reason why the ASEAN has failed massively. In fact, it didn't do anything about what was happening in the Philippines. So this is a total failure of the international community in the Philippines, and I just hope that in the coming years that is going to change, especially with the continuing campaign for accountability here for the drug war killings. I will stop there, and I'm sure there are others who will have questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And that was perfect timing. And with that, I'd like to introduce you all to Diego Garcia Davis. Diego is program manager at the Open Society Foundations. He is a Colombian political scientist with over 15 years of experience analyzing, mediating, and monitoring the Colombian socio-political armed conflict, and has conducted extensive research on issues such as the relationship between violence, narco-trafficking, and social-political conflict. As an expert on peace building and human rights, Garcia Davis has worked for the Organization of American States and USAID, managing and coordinating projects in areas such as disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration of combatants, prevention of forced recruitment of children, and protection of human rights. Thank you.
Kat, thank you very much. And I'd like to start by thanking David and recognizing his relentless effort to put the spot always on the brutality of the war on drugs. And I'm thankful for inviting me to sort of bring the perspective from the region. I'd like to sort of pack the intervention in 3 or 4 elements. First, trying to dissect or understand the narrative that's justifying what we're seeing in the Caribbean and the Pacific. Also, as David mentioned, in Brazil. Refer how to interdiction, the main sort of tactic that has been used to seize cocaine coming out of South America has been flawed, has been limited, but is less brutal, of course. Refer to how we see a prequel of what we're seeing these days conducted in international and national waters in Latin America. To finally refer to who are that people that is basically on those boats. So if we go to the narrative aspect of the situation, if we think of narcoterrorism is a term coined in the 80s by the Peruvian and the Colombian governments when they were describing how drug trafficking organizations use terror tactics to either attack counter-narcotics police or civilian targets. We all remember the violence in the 90s in Colombia exerted by the cartels. Over time, that morphed from being a descriptive term to identify a massive number of phenomena under this sort of very simplistic term. Now we're identifying fishermen, for instance, who are the victims of these targets as narco-terrorists. If we dissect the term narco-terrorist, we always think of terrorism as the threat to the existence of society, and narco, drug, a threat to morale. So if you marry those two terms, it becomes quite efficient in the narrative. It justifies what we're seeing these days, and it becomes sort of a free ticket for extrajudicial killings. The massacre in Rio was later justified by the governor as an attack on narco-terrorism. So we're seeing how the region is replicating exactly the same narrative. Interdiction, on the other hand, has been normally used by law enforcement following a very sort of tight process of intelligence, then actions, and law enforcement. And we see the metrics that the World Report announces every year on the amounts, tons of cocaine that have been seized. It seems that those metrics don't matter anymore. We don't know how many cocaine has been stopped due to those airstrikes. But interdiction is flawed in any case. Interdiction has its limitations. I was speaking to a couple of experts that are present in the room, and they can talk more about how cocaine moves on the sea, especially on containers, on legal vessels that move around the world. Only less than 10% of those containers are scanned. And the amount of cocaine that's found on those containers is immense. So again, metrics matter very much, but in those efforts, we haven't seen a missile have been fired. So what we can do around that policy, potentially targeting and doing more intelligence on those corruption networks at ports, not only in Latin America, in Europe and the US as well. But where we come from, we have to remember Operación Martillo, Hammer Operation, which was an operation in the Pacific Sea, which was an agreement between Latin American countries and foreign law enforcement for those law enforcement patrol international waters, detain fishermen, board vessels with international flag or foreign flags, and bring them to court in North America. What had happened since then is an evolution and a deterioration of human rights, of course. Operación Martillo just basically disappeared fishermen that went into the sea. Those families didn't know where they were. They were sentenced to 15, 20-year sentences in the US, having all that impact in impoverished communities. Operación Martillo also created this void, legal void, in which the fishermen were detained, brought into US Navy vessels, kept there for weeks without due trial, of course. Who are these families? Who is these people that's basically conducting and carrying cocaine? These are basically artisanal fishermen from the Pacific and the Caribbean, mostly Afro-Latino communities, impoverished, usually men between 20 and 50 years old. 10 years ago, we conducted a research, or we support an organization conducting a research trying to characterize those communities that were affected by the Operación Martillo Hammer operation in Ecuador. And we saw that these communities, fishery communities, were pressured by piracy, lack of access to state support, and of course, the impact that we're seeing these days. Just to close with a reflection, we're seeing the governments directing their harshest violence against, of course, poor communities again. Most cocaine moves through legal vessels, and we're seeing performative violence, which is very profitable in narrative and politically. I'd like to close with a quote from a relative from one of those fishing families. "The fish are scarce. There are pirates who rob them at sea. My brother, now in prison, was robbed several times, so he took the other route. Our family suffered many problems. For instance, my 5-year-old daughter was kidnapped and killed by drug trafficking organization to pressure us engage in cocaine trafficking. To help us, my brother decided to engage in cocaine trafficking." So again, this is not about a narco-terrorist. This is about coastal families living in shrinking livelihoods. Thank you.
Thank you so much for helping put a human face on the people who are being destroyed by these extrajudicial killings. With that, I would like to invite up Annie Scheel, who is joining us digitally as well. Through her role as the U.S. Advocacy Director at the Center for Civilians in Conflict, or CIVIC, Annie leads policy analysis and advocacy around the civilian harm implications of U.S. military operations and security assistance, engages with U.S. policymakers, lawmakers, and advocates to engage the protection of civilians in conflict, and helps build coalitions of like-minded organizations to advance U.S. policies that improve the lives of civilians living in conflict. Prior to joining CIVIC, Annie worked as a research program manager at Stanford University, where she led research on civilian harm and humanitarian response. And she spent 3 years at the U.S. State Department, where she worked on human rights, civilian protection, and security sector reform as a founding member of the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, or DRL, Office of Security and Human Rights. Annie?
Thank you so much, Kat, and thank you to my fellow panelists. Excuse me. Thank you all for having me. My name is Annie Scheel, as you noted, and I'm the U.S. Director at the Center for Civilians in Conflict, or CIVIC. We are a global humanitarian organization focused on protecting civilians in conflict. We have teams operating in conflict-affected communities around the world. And I lead, as you noted, our work in the United States, where we advocate for U.S. policies that protect civilians. I will also be speaking today about the recent U.S. use of force in the Caribbean and the Pacific under the guise of a so-called war on drugs and the legal and moral stakes of these strikes. And I want to start with the fact that, despite the fact that my organization focuses on the protection of civilians in conflict, I want to start with the very important point that when we talk about these strikes in the Caribbean and the Pacific, there is no armed conflict here, right? The U.S. is not at war against drug trafficking organizations. Alleged drug traffickers are not lawful military objectives, and there is no evidence that those targeted pose any imminent threat to individuals or to the United States. And so that means that whatever their identities, the more than 150 people killed now in these strikes were civilians. And the strikes amounted to, as others have noted, extrajudicial executions, extrajudicial killings, or murder. This is true under international law, right, where we know that all people, no matter where they live or what crime they have been accused of, have fundamental human rights, including the rights to life and to due process. When someone is accused of a crime, they get a trial, not a summary execution. Yet instead of interdicting vessels, including some that have been documented as turning around, President Trump has chosen to simply kill the accused. No arrest, no evidence, no trial, just a summary execution. And indeed, UN special rapporteurs have condemned these strikes as extrajudicial killings in violation of international law. And a former chief prosecutor at the International Criminal Court has said that these strikes amount to crimes against humanity as a planned systematic attack against civilians during peacetime. I also want to note that these strikes are also illegal under U.S. domestic law, right? Under the U.S. Constitution, it's the U.S. Congress, not the president, who has the role and responsibility to decide when, where, and against whom the United States uses force. Congress has not authorized the use of military force against criminal groups, and the designation of criminal groups as foreign terrorist organizations does not unlock any exceptional wartime authorities. I also think it's important to note here that in addition to the precedents from the harmful war on drugs, in quotes, in which the U.S. has conducted these strikes also expand on decades of power abuses from the so-called war on terror, in which the U.S. has conducted lethal strikes to kill terror suspects outside of conflicts to which the United States is a party, and again, in gross abuse of congressional authorizations. But these strikes do also break very dangerous new ground, given both the lack of any armed attack against the United States and the complete lack of domestic authorization by Congress. Other panelists have, I think, also really emphasized the important human cost, the human impact of these strikes and other similar operations, and I want to do the same here. The human impacts of these extrajudicial killings are far-reaching, right? So we are seeing, of course, again, first and foremost, the murder of over 150 civilians in a violation of the fundamental right to life. These strikes also cause devastating harm to families and communities of those killed, who may never know what happened to them. Right? The identities of most of these victims remain unknown. And so for these families, this is a disappearance. We are also seeing reports of intense fear and psychological trauma for coastal communities in the region who have experienced bodies washing up on the shore. And as my fellow panelists noted, fear for their lives when they fish, when they support their livelihoods. The impact is not limited to the victims, their families, and their communities, but also to the rule of law that is meant to protect all of us. Underpinning these strikes is the extremely dangerous notion that the US president can label anyone a quote unquote narco terrorist and execute people who have allegedly committed crimes without due process. Under the administration's apparent reasoning, there seems to be very little preventing murders of other alleged criminals, drug traffickers or otherwise, inside the United States. Accountability for these violations is, of course, critical, and yet at the same time, as we know, can be very, very challenging in the US and the international system. Within the US, I actually want to start with one critical aspect of accountability, which is non-repetition. And that is that first and foremost, these strikes have to stop, and we cannot allow them to be normalized as they are really currently being, right? We are seeing them constantly reported. US Congress, as I mentioned, has a very important role to play here. Congress must condemn these strikes as unilateral, unconstitutional, extrajudicial executions and reassert its power to decide whether or when the United States uses force. Congress should also demand a thorough and transparent investigation into the strikes and their compliance with US and international law. And using its constitutional power of the purse, Congress should refuse to fund airstrikes like those that are being carried out today. Legal accountability is, of course, also critical, though, again, historically very challenging in the US context, both due to challenges with domestic prosecution of government officials related to security matters, and also due to US rejection of ICC jurisdiction. There are currently ongoing cases against the US brought on behalf of victims, though we don't yet know the outcome of those. Universal jurisdiction is, of course, another possible advocacy or accountability pathway, which could apply in states in which victims are nationals or even uninvolved states. It's also very important to focus on securing accountability, amends, and reparations for victims and their families. Civic, my organization, was founded on the concept of victim-centered amends for civilian harm. And in so many cases, not only are we seeing that political will is, of course, a paramount challenge here, but so is safely reaching families of those killed and ensuring that they can pursue accountability with full agency and ownership, especially given the fear that has been noted already. And then lastly, in this multilateral forum, I also want to emphasize the responsibility of the international community and third states, right? So third states providing support to the United States to carry out these killings need to cease this support immediately. Extrajudicial killings and crimes against humanity are internationally wrongful acts under customary international law, and third states can incur legal responsibility for aiding or assisting another state in their commission of these internationally wrongful acts. In addition to state responsibility, US airstrikes in the Caribbean and Pacific implicate individual criminal responsibility under international criminal law. State officials and other individuals can be held liable for aiding and abetting US extrajudicial killings and crimes against humanity. So countries that are enabling these strikes through things like intelligence support, US basing, or other relevant forms of cooperation should cease their support immediately or risk incurring legal liability. And I will note that we've already seen several major US security partners, including the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, and Canada, cease intelligence sharing in connection with these legal strikes due to that risk. So I will leave it there. But again, thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much to my fellow panelists. And really grateful to learn from you all as well. So over to you, Kat.
Thank you so much, Annie. And with that, I would like to invite questions from the audience here today. For those of you who are joining online, please feel free to drop your questions into the chat box, and we'll be looking for those as well. For those of you in the room, you can simply raise your hands, and I will request that you keep them short. And remember, the question ends in a question mark.
Hi, briefly, 2 points I want to make. My name is Pien from Transnational Institute. The first point refers to intelligence sharing and it's around the issue of the role of the international community, how silent they have been and how worrying that is that on these attacks in the Caribbean specifically. We've tried to get the Dutch government, because the Kingdom of the Netherlands has territory in the Caribbean and has 2 military bases that are being used by the US. And we have tried to alert them to the risks. And we've understood that the intelligence sharing has stopped now, but still it's very unclear to what extent these bases are used. And we're still trying to investigate a little bit more. The other point is on affected communities in the Caribbean directly by these attacks. I have shared a letter with DRC Net from a traditional cannabis cultivator from St. Vincent and the Grenadines. It is not just cocaine that's being trafficked through the Caribbean, it's also cannabis. And I asked him to give his opinion about what the effect has been of these attacks on in the region, and he wrote a letter that I've shared, and I think it will be made available through the DRC network with the public, so you can all read what they experience as an effect of these attacks. So it's not actually a question; it's just two remarks I want to make. Okay, thank you.
Do we have any other questions? All right, then I will take, oh,
Yeah, we do have.
we
one
have
in
one
the chat.
online. Okay, Filene Edbauer from My Brain, My Choice Initiative asks a question for Carlos Conde. Have medical professionals and addiction researchers formed some opposition to the war on Shabu in the Philippines or the Asian region?
Yeah,
Carlos, if you'd like
thanks
to
for
come
the,
on
yeah.
mic, yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much for the question. There certainly have been medical professionals and groups like NOBOX, which I think was also involved in this event, who have opposed the drug war and the violence. But the problem was there was just too much, I think, popularity by Mr. Duterte, and also the police operations were just so thorough, and it basically just kept everybody else silent about what was going on and just approved what was going on. To the credit of these medical professionals, we have the Medical Action Group, for instance. They've done their share in documenting many of these abuses. We have the No Box Transition, who also did the same thing, and also certain groups in many other places in certain places in the Philippines, not just Manila, who also helped document the impact of the drug war. So yeah, there have been some of those.
Thank you. If we don't have any other questions, I have one. I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative on this one. I'm curious. So again, today is the 1-year anniversary of Duterte's arrest. He is currently being held at the ICC. What happens from here? What happens with his arrest, but also what can we expect with the extrajudicial killings that have been continuing in the Philippines past his arrest?
Can I answer that quickly?
Yes, please.
Yeah. So since the confirmation of charges hearing in The Hague, late last month started, as you know, the chamber has 60 days to decide on whether to pursue a case against Mr. Duterte. So we are now like on a wait and see mode here in terms of what's going to happen next. There's a lot of anticipation about the real possibility that the chamber will confirm the charges and then bring this to trial. So, I mean, particularly for the victims of the drug war, that is something that's in their minds, and they are hoping that will happen. Yeah.
I'll add to that. There is an issue that will be coming before the appeals chamber in the ICC, which has already gone through the pretrial. This is a jurisdictional question relating to the fact that the Philippines' withdrawal from the treaty was effective in March 2019. Whereas the prosecutor did not submit a request to the pretrial chamber to initiate a full investigation until sometime after that. And a lot of the debate, and I wrote a couple of columns about that in Rappler one in Rappler, one in Just Security. The debate centers around language in Article 12, referring to states that are parties to this statute, as well as in the article on withdrawal, Article 127, that matters already before the court shall not be prejudiced. And so there's a debate on what the implications of the use of the word "are" should be seen as, which I think is mistaken to even look at. I think it's the meaning of parties to this statute, which when one looks at that, it's easy to see that can mean parties at some past time of relevance. But there's even a debate over what the meaning of the court is, despite language in the treaty stating that the office of the prosecutor is part of the court. And I wish I could say that it's only the defense making arguments that are incredible, but in a prior appeals court ruling, there was a dissenting opinion from two judges, one of whom is still on the chamber, saying that that the court could not exercise its jurisdiction at that point because of the withdrawal being effective. I think it's mistaken, but we're also waiting on that, and it sometimes keeps me up at night.
I may quickly add, if I may, just about directly related to the question, is that really the onus now is on on President Marcos to go back to the ICC, to go back to ratify the Rome Statute. But there have been some discouraging signs that yesterday, or was it today, his spokesperson said that the Philippines under Mr. Marcos is not interested in going back to the ICC. So that's kind of a downer there, because that has been one of the key advocacy a push we've been doing here in Manila and also in Europe and in other places, which is for the Philippines to go back to the ICC, given what's happening and given the fact that accountability is practically zero still, regardless of the fact that Mr. Duterte is in The Hague. So we don't know. It's not very categorical at this point from the side of Mr. Marcos, because it was his spokesperson who said that, but it looks like we're not going back.
Oh, Inez, would you like to make your comment out loud so people in the room can hear it? Or we can
Sure.
read it, whichever you prefer.
Oh, you can read it. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Can you hear? No, it was just a thought, I guess. Every time discussions around this happens, it's just that, well, I'll read out what I placed in the chat, essentially. I'm sorry, I cannot turn on my video, but it's just when I think about all these headline impunities, that they do not come from nowhere. And they grow really from the smaller permissions we normalize along the way. And this is, of course, driven about how we understand drugs and also how we view or perceive persons who are associated with drugs, people whose lives include drugs. So, for example, in the Philippines, what we learned was not only that the killings happened, it was that many people, and including people who honestly believed they were doing the right thing, had already accepted the thinking that made those murders possible or that made them not question them. So for example, in the Philippines, it was about placing people in drug watch lists. People thought that was okay because they thought that was how you get help to people. And that punishing them or forcing them into treatment under the threat of arrest or being subject or the threat of being subjected to police operations is called care, or that stigma somehow served a social purpose. I was in a reform meeting where actually somebody who's moving around in the human rights space actually said, but we have to accept that stigma is beneficial to society. So if those kinds of thinking are there, these are the things that make impunity fester, and that we need to catch and recognize. Somebody actually said, that, well, it's okay to sacrifice some lives of drug users for the greater good of society. Again, from somebody who's moving around in the right space. So I guess what I just wanted to put out on the table is this, maybe for some reflecting also, that beyond condemning the headline atrocities, how do we also recognize and interrupt this quieter, more insidious reasoning that still prevails? That keeps making the murders and things like this possible. So what are we still letting sound normal, for example, in our own spaces, in the way we talk, in the way we frame things when it comes to issues around drugs and persons, and concerns, matters around persons whose lives include drugs? What are the exceptions we're making that make it easier for people to accept the next atrocity? So those were just my thoughts for this one. So thank you so much.
And that was Inez Feria from Nobox Transitions Foundation in the Philippines, who were sorry circumstances prevented from joining us all here at the CND.
And what a wonderful sentiment, or important sentiment, I should say, rather, to wrap up this panel on. We are coming up on time, but before we...
So I do have one more.
You have one more question?
One more thing. I didn't get a chance to note.
Okay,
before.
well, good news, because I was going to ask panelists for closing thoughts before we end the panel.
Okay. Why don't you go first, Diego?
Okay, thank you again, David and Kat, for an excellent moderation. The message is clear. We're using the most brutal tools that the state has to suppress poverty, to suppress marginalized communities, and we're not doing anything to protect public health or human rights. So it's basically a waste of lives, a waste of resources, and now we're seeing, if we account for the Brazilian victims as well, almost 300 families that lost their relatives under the tag of narco-terrorism.
So I talked about the ICC before. It's important to be aware that the U.S. government currently has sanctions on all of the top officials at the ICC and others for activity related to the ICC. And we don't know what the intentions are. So that's a question mark on the continuation, regarding the continuation of that institution. It affects its ability to move all cases forward. But if for anyone who does hope or intend to gather information that could be used for accountability purposes, this has to be done very carefully. The sanctions are constructed around the concept of protected persons, which is persons from the U.S. or countries that are major allies of the U.S. And that obviously includes the president and others involved in these boat strikes. My consultation with an attorney concluded that there's a way to do this, but very carefully. The consequences can be very draconian for a U.S. citizen or anyone exposed to U.S. jurisdiction. And while that might not be such a high risk in terms of its probability, non-U.S. nationals can easily be sanctioned on this at any time. So be careful, talk to a lawyer.
Always talk to a lawyer. Carlos, Annie, do you have some closing thoughts for us?
Yeah, quickly. This is Carlos. Yes. Really now, domestic accountability mechanisms in the Philippines are shot. They're not working. They haven't really improved significantly since 2016 when Mr. Duterte came to power. So there's little, if at all, any optimism that the courts in the Philippines, the law enforcement system in the Philippines will change anything in the near term. While there have been some promises of improvement of the situation here, we still have to see those promises be come to reality. Now, this is where also I think I'd like to emphasize where the international community needs to really come in much more robustly, much more significantly than they did the last time. We have to keep in mind that Mr. Duterte is not gone, but more importantly, her family, her allies are poised to take over the Philippines again in 2028 in the next elections. His daughter, the vice president, is going to run for president in 2028, and God knows what she will do. Our guess is that she will do what her father did in 2016. They're basically going to be doing the same, implementing the same template. So, what's the foil here? How are we going to stop another drug war 2.0 from happening under her regime? I don't know. So this is why the international community really needs to step in and really make true to their commitment for human rights here.
And I will just jump in and close really with some reflection and echoing of some of the points that Inez raised, which I think were really important. I am not an expert on the drug policy side, but from a national security perspective, we also are having to contend with the normalization that we've seen from the, again, kind of quote unquote, global war on terror of the US. And that means that when the US government calls someone a quote, narco terrorist, people in the US accept that, right? They accept that the use of force against people who are deemed terrorist is just what we do. And now there is, again, a huge risk of normalization of these boat strikes and this concept of narco-terrorism in the United States as well. So I would just echo that that's something to be really vigilant of. And in order to counter that normalization, we need much more international condemnation and an immediate end to international assistance to these extrajudicial killings and to the support of third states. So thank you.
Thank you. What I hope you will all take from our discussion here today is that the so-called war on drugs has never been a war on drugs. The war on drugs is a war on us. It is a war on people. It is war on every individual who loses their lives every single day due to extrajudicial killings carried out because of drug enforcement and control measures around the world. It is a war on their families, on their children, and it is a war on their communities and on international norms around democracy and human rights and rule of law. It is a war on people, but it is also people who are speaking out, people who are educating, people who are advocating, and people who are bringing about change. So with that, thank you all for joining us here for Murder on the Land and Sea, Extrajudicial Drug War Killings in the 21st Century, and here at the United Nations Commission on Narcotic Drugs. I hope that you will use your time here to speak out for the people, for the victims of the war on drugs, and to help shape those policies, to use these institutions to be able to save lives and fight for freedom. Thank you to the DRC Net Foundation, aka stopthedrugwar.org, for organizing this panel here today and for helping bring forward this issue of rule of law, as well as the Associazione Luca Coccioni, Drug Policy Alliance, Forum Droghe, International Drug Law Advocacy and Resource Center, No Peace Without Justice, No Box Transitions Philippines, the Philippine Coalition for the International Criminal Court, Veterans Action Council, Washington Office on Latin America, Students for Sensible Drug Policy, members of the local Filipino community, Maricel Rojas, and our panelists, David Borden, Carlos Conde, Diego Garcia Davis, Annie Shiel, and to every single one of the advocates on the ground in the Philippines, in Latin America, and everywhere else that these drug war killings are happening on a daily, regular basis, who are doing everything that they can to save lives and fight for justice. There are some sign-up sheets going around the room. Please sign up on those. Otherwise, if you can register online at DRC Net or with SSDP for updates on extrajudicial drug war killings and what you can do to help put a stop to them. I also invite you to join our side event on research harm and how drug scheduling undermines science, public health, and evidence-based policy on Friday, March 13th at 10 a.m. in room M7 of the Vienna International Center or online. Thank you all for being here today.